May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Across the continent, from the muddy fields of Normandy to the rubble-strewn streets of Berlin, silence replaces the thunder of artillery. But the landscape tells a different story. In countless staging areas, motor pools and makeshift depots scattered across France, Belgium, Germany, and beyond, thousands upon thousands of olive-drab vehicles sit in precise rows, their engines still warm from the final push into the Reich. Among them, the Ford GPW, the iconic quarter-ton 4x4 that carried American forces across every European battlefield. These machines had crossed oceans, survived artillery barrages, and rolled through the gates of concentration camps. They were more than vehicles. They were the mechanical heartbeat of liberation. But now, with Nazi Germany defeated, a logistical nightmare emerged. Over 640,000 jeeps had been produced during the war. Tens of thousands remained in Europe, property of the United States Army. They were worn, battle-scarred, but still functional. The question facing military planners was brutal in its simplicity. What do you do with an army's worth of vehicles when the war is over and shipping them home costs more than their worth? The war was over, but a new mystery was just beginning. What really happened to these 20,000 Ford GPW Jeeps after the guns fell silent? The Ford GPW wasn't just another military vehicle. It was the result of a desperate collaboration between Willys Overland and Ford Motor Company, producing identical Jeeps to meet the insatiable demands of global war. Ford alone manufactured over 277,000 GPWs between 1941 and 1945, distinguishing them with the F stamped into various components and the scripted Ford logo on the rear panel. These vehicles weren't concentrated in a single location. By May 1945, American forces occupied positions from the Atlantic coast to central Germany, from Norway to northern Italy. Every division, every regiment, every battalion had its complement of jeeps. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 20,000 Ford GPWs remained on European soil after VE Day, though the true number may have been significantly higher. Each jeep represented approximately 2,450 pounds of steel, aluminum, and rubber. Multiply that by 20,000 and you're looking at over 24 million pounds of military hardware suddenly rendered surplus. In a devastated Europe where steel was precious and gasoline scarce, these machines became instant objects of desire, opportunity, and bureaucratic headache. The standard procedure would be to ship them home, but the mathematics were merciless. The cost of shipping a single Jeep back to the United States exceeded the vehicle's replacement value. The military had already shifted production priorities. New vehicles were rolling off assembly lines in Detroit. The wartime Jeeps, with their worn bearings, cracked chassis, and hundreds of thousands of hard miles, simply weren't worth the freight charges. The first days after surrender brought chaos that military planners hadn't fully anticipated. In Germany, massive motor pools materialized seemingly overnight as units consolidated their positions. Near Frankfurt, an area equivalent to 50 football fields became a sea of military vehicles. Jeeps sat fender to fender, many still carrying the dust of their final missions. The United States Army faced an immediate problem: security. These weren't museum pieces, they were fully functional military vehicles with keys often left in the ignition. In the power vacuum of occupied Germany, Jeeps began disappearing, not by the dozen, but by the 100. German civilians, displaced persons, and even Allied soldiers took what they could. In France, the situation differed. The French government, desperate to rebuild its shattered infrastructure, entered into negotiations with American forces. Within weeks, deals were being struck. Some Jeeps were formally transferred to French military units. Others were acquired through less official channels. By August 1945, hundreds of American Jeeps wore fresh coats of French military paint, their Ford markings still visible beneath. The British military government in occupied Germany established salvage depots. Near Hamburg, Cologne, and Munich, massive yards received thousands of vehicles. Military police guarded these depots, but the sheer scale made comprehensive security impossible. Night raids became common. Local residents, many of whom had mechanical skills from working in German war industries, could strip a Jeep of valuable components in under an hour. Rust began almost immediately. The European weather showed no mercy to vehicles designed for rapid replacement rather than long-term storage. Spring rains in 1946 turned motor pools into mud pits. Jeeps sat up to their axles in water, their exposed metal surfaces oxidizing. Maintenance had stopped. No one was changing oil, checking tire pressure, or protecting exposed surfaces. These were machines in limbo, waiting for someone to decide their fate. In Italy, American forces faced unique challenges. Partisan groups who had fought alongside the Allies now eyed military equipment as tools for potential political conflicts. The Italian government wanted vehicles for reconstruction. American commanders found themselves negotiating with multiple parties, each claiming legitimate need. Some Jeeps were painted over and absorbed into Italian civilian use so quickly that proper documentation never existed. By late 1945, the decision came down from Washington. The majority of surplus vehicles in Europe would be destroyed or sold as scrap. The cost-benefit analysis was unforgiving. The Army needed to demobilize quickly, reduce overseas footprint, and eliminate maintenance burdens. Thousands of serviceable Jeeps received death sentences. The scrapping operations began in earnest during winter 1945 to 46. Near Antwerp, Belgium, a facility processed up to 200 vehicles daily. The procedure was industrial and brutal. Jeeps arrived under their own power or on flatbed trucks. Workers drained fluids, whatever hadn't already leaked out. Usable parts like batteries, tires, and instruments were removed for salvage. Then came the crusher. Imagine standing at the edge of this operation. The screech of metal, the hydraulic hiss of the press, the thunderous crack as a chassis folded in on itself. A vehicle that had survived Normandy, the Ardennes, and the Rhine, crossing reduced to a cube of scrap metal in 90 seconds. By the end of each day, towers of crushed steel sat waiting for railway cars to haul them to foundries. But the numbers didn't add up. Official records indicated that approximately 8,000 Jeeps went through formal scrapping programs in 1945 to 46. That left at least 12,000 unaccounted for. The discrepancy wasn't mysterious to anyone on the ground. The black market for military vehicles was the worst-kept secret in occupied Europe. In Germany's American zone, entire motor pools vanished over single weekends. Investigation reports from 1946 document the systematic theft of hundreds of Jeeps, many driven across borders into France, Switzerland, or even as far as Spain. Military police estimated that 60% of stolen vehicles were taken by opportunistic civilians, 30% by displaced persons seeking transportation or trade goods, and 10% by American servicemen who saw profit opportunities. The French government's official acquisition of surplus Jeeps masked significant irregularities. Documentation from late 1945 shows France received approximately 2,000 Jeeps through proper channels. French motor vehicle registrations from 1946 to 1948, however, show over 5,000 American military Jeeps in civilian hands. The gap suggests unofficial transfers, direct purchases from individual soldiers, or outright theft that French authorities chose not to investigate too closely. Scrapping operations in Germany had their own peculiarities. Local contractors hired to dismantle vehicles often set aside the best specimens. Components disappeared into the German reconstruction economy. Engines ended up powering generators, sawmills, and improvised trucks. Axles and drivetrains were grafted onto civilian vehicles. Transfer cases became prized possessions for farmers needing power takeoffs for equipment. While crushing machines consumed thousands of Jeeps, other vehicles found second lives that would have surprised their original manufacturers. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, accelerated the distribution of American surplus to European allies. Jeeps became reconstruction tools, officially transferred to governments desperate for transportation infrastructure. The Netherlands received approximately 800 Ford GPWs between 1946 and 1948. Dutch authorities converted many into postal delivery vehicles, agricultural trucks, and fire department first responders. In the polders, where traditional vehicles struggled with mud and irrigation channels, the Jeep's four-wheel drive capability made it invaluable. Some remained in Dutch government service into the 1960s. Norway's story reveals an unexpected twist. Approximately 300 American Jeeps, many of them Ford GPWs, were transferred to Norwegian forces in 1945 to 46. But Norway's climate proved devastating. Salt-laden coastal air accelerated corrosion. By 1950, the Norwegian military was cannibalizing its Jeep fleet to keep a fraction operational. Paradoxically, this harsh environment preserved dozens in unusual ways. Vehicles abandoned in remote locations, deemed not worth recovering, sat undisturbed for decades. The Italian repurposing effort was perhaps most creative. Fiat secured a contract to refurbish and modify American Jeeps for civilian use. Between 1946 and 1949, over 2,000 Jeeps passed through Fiat facilities. Engineers removed military fittings, installed civilian seats, and modified bodies for various commercial applications. Some became rudimentary taxis in Rome and Naples. Others served as the chassis for small delivery trucks. A few were stretched and modified into passenger vehicles carrying 8 or 9 people through mountain villages. Greece received substantial military aid, including hundreds of surplus Jeeps as the Greek Civil War intensified in 1946. American GPWs fought on both sides. Government forces used officially transferred vehicles, while communist partisans drove Jeeps captured in raids or purchased through black market channels. By 1949, the survivors were so thoroughly mixed into Greek military and civilian use that distinguishing their original source became impossible. Austria's occupied zones each handled surplus differently. In the American zone, formal auctions sold Jeeps to Austrian civilians for reconstruction purposes. Prices started at approximately $150 per vehicle, a fraction of original cost but still substantial for war-devastated Austrians. Records show 342 Jeeps sold at auction in 1946 alone. The Soviet zone simply confiscated American vehicles found in their territory, shipping many eastward. Some GPWs ended their days in Soviet agricultural collectives thousands of miles from where they'd served. France's relationship with American Jeeps evolved beyond simple acquisition. By 1948, French engineers were reverse engineering captured and purchased GPWs to develop their own light military vehicles. The Hotchkiss M201, introduced in 1954, bore unmistakable resemblance to the American Jeep, though Hotchkiss insisted it was an original design. Farmers across rural France drove American Jeeps modified with agricultural implements. Many remained in daily use through the 1970s, their Ford markings long since painted over. While most Jeeps met industrial ends or were worked to death in their second careers, a small number survived through improbable circumstances. These are the stories that captivate collectors today. In 1978, a French farmer near Normandy cleared out a barn unused since before his birth. Beneath decades of hay and debris, he discovered a 1943 Ford GPW, still wearing its invasion star. The Jeep had been hidden by his grandfather, a resistance member who'd acquired it from a retreating American unit in 1944 and concealed it from German patrols and later French authorities. The vehicle hadn't run in 34 years, but its preservation in the dry barn meant that with mechanical restoration, it could run again. Norway provided the most dramatic preservation stories. In 1991, hikers in a remote mountain valley discovered a Jeep half buried in what appeared to be an old rock slide. Recovery efforts revealed a 1944 GPW that had been abandoned during winter exercises in 1945. The avalanche that buried it in spring 1946 also preserved it. The cold, dry conditions under tons of rock and ice kept corrosion minimal. After extraction and restoration, this Jeep now resides in a Norwegian military museum. The most extensive survivor field was discovered in 1963 near Verdun, France. Road construction crews unearthed what appeared to be a massive disposal site. Investigation revealed approximately 75 American vehicles, including 23 identifiable Ford GPWs that had been buried in a quarry in late 1945. Rather than crush them, local authorities simply pushed them into the hole and covered them with soil. The anaerobic conditions preserved components remarkably well. Several were restored to running condition, while others provided parts for restoration projects worldwide. Germany's forests concealed surprises. Allied jeeps disabled by mines or mechanical failure were sometimes simply pushed off roads into wooded areas. The rapid advance in 1944 to 45 meant recovery operations couldn't keep pace. As German forests regenerated, they swallowed these vehicles. Over the decades, hunters, hikers, and eventually metal detector enthusiasts discovered dozens of hidden jeeps. A 1988 find in the Hürtgen forest revealed a GPW that had hit a mine in December 1944. The crew survived, but the jeep was abandoned. It sat for 44 years, slowly being consumed by vegetation. Private collectors began seriously seeking wartime jeeps in the 1970s, but the trail was often cold. Many GPWs had been so thoroughly integrated into civilian use that tracing their military origins became impossible. A farmer's utility vehicle in rural Italy might have been a jeep that rolled through Rome in June 1944, but documentation was lost or never existed. Decades of modifications, paint jobs, and part swaps erased provenance. The story of the Swiss jeeps remains one of the war's odder footnotes. Switzerland, officially neutral, somehow acquired approximately 120 American jeeps between 1945 and 1947. Official explanations cite commercial purchases and private sales, but the truth is murkier. Evidence suggests American soldiers stationed near the Swiss border ran a profitable smuggling operation, driving jeeps across and selling them for hard currency. Swiss authorities never investigated too carefully. These jeeps served in Swiss civilian capacities until the 1960s, and several still exist in Swiss collections today. The Belgian Congo received an unexpected shipment in 1947. As Belgium worked to maintain its African colony, someone in the logistics chain decided surplus European jeeps could serve in Africa. Approximately 200 vehicles, many of them Ford GPWs, were loaded onto ships and sent to the Congo. The tropical climate proved catastrophic. Within 2 years, the entire batch was mechanically unsalvageable, victims of humidity, termites, and diseases that attacked rubber components. Local populations stripped them for parts, and the chassis became foundations for buildings in remote villages. Perhaps the strangest chapter involves the Israeli military. As Jewish forces prepared for the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, they desperately needed vehicles. Through a network of sympathetic veterans and black market dealers, American jeeps began arriving in Palestine. Some were officially decommissioned and sold, others were stolen from European depots and shipped via circuitous routes. By 1948, the nascent Israeli Defense Forces operated several hundred American jeeps, many of them Ford GPWs. These vehicles, which had helped liberate Europe, now fought in the deserts of the Middle East. A few survive in Israeli military museums, their journey from Detroit to Normandy to the Negev Desert documented in fading unit histories. In 1952, a Ford GPW surfaced in Syria, captured from Israeli forces during a border skirmish. It was put on display in Damascus as a trophy of war, an American vehicle that had passed through at least 3 armies. Its ultimate fate is unknown, but photographs from the era show it prominently displayed, still bearing hastily painted-over markings from previous owners. The ghost jeeps of Germany entered urban legend. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, reports circulated of driverless American jeeps seen on remote roads at night. The rational explanation was prosaic: thieves testing stolen vehicles or smugglers moving black market goods. But in the haunted landscape of post-war Germany, where millions had died and cities lay in ruins, such sightings took on supernatural overtones. Some Germans believed they were phantom vehicles from the war, eternally replaying their final missions. A purely accidental preservation occurred in 1956, when a Ford GPW being used on a French construction site was buried in a collapsed trench. The rescue operation saved the workers but abandoned the Jeep. The construction company simply poured the foundation over it. In 1989, demolition of the building revealed the entombed vehicle. Though crushed and corroded, it became a time capsule of post-war construction practices and the casual treatment of what had once been precious military hardware. Today, finding an original Ford GPW with verifiable wartime European service is the holy grail of military vehicle collecting. Values for authenticated examples routinely exceed $40,000, with exceptional specimens commanding six figures. The market has grown sophisticated with forensic examination of serial numbers, component codes, and paint layers to establish provenance. European museums hold the most significant collections. The Overlord Museum in Normandy displays 17 Jeeps, several of them Ford GPWs recovered from the region. Each tells a story of the specific unit that drove it, researched through careful cross-referencing of serial numbers with military records. The Imperial War Museum in London houses 3 GPWs, including one that participated in the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. Private collections across Europe hold dozens more. In Belgium, a restoration shop specializes exclusively in Ford GPWs, maintaining a database of known survivors worldwide. They estimate that fewer than 400 Ford GPWs with documented European wartime service still exist globally. Of those, perhaps 150 remain in Europe, a tiny fraction of the 20,000 that ended the war on the continent. Underwater discoveries continue. The Mediterranean has yielded several Jeeps over the decades, lost during amphibious operations or thrown overboard from damaged transport ships. In 2003, divers off Anzio, Italy, discovered a remarkably preserved GPW in 40 feet of water. The salt water had corroded much, but the sand burial preserved the chassis stamp and serial number, allowing historians to trace it to the 3rd Infantry Division. It now sits in an Italian maritime museum, a ghostly artifact of amphibious warfare. Some of the most poignant survivors are trucks that remained in continuous civilian use for decades, their wartime service unknown to most who saw them. A particular example in southern Germany served as a farm truck from 1946 until 1978, over 30 years of continuous use. The farmer who operated it had acquired it through official Allied demilitarization channels, never knowing its specific wartime history. When he finally retired it, and a collector examined it closely, they found evidence suggesting it had served on the Eastern Front, repair patches typical of cold weather damage, Cyrillic graffiti scratched on interior panels by Soviet soldiers who had briefly captured it before it was recaptured by German forces. The environmental toll of these vehicles should not be overlooked. Thousands of Opel Blitz trucks were simply abandoned where they stopped running, in fields, forests, along roadsides, in ditches. Over the decades, they slowly disintegrated, leaking oil, fuel, and other fluids into the soil. In some former battlefield areas in Eastern Europe, the environmental legacy of abandoned vehicles from all sides of the conflict remains a concern even today. Cleanup operations occasionally uncover rusted truck frames still buried in overgrown forests. The scrap metal from destroyed Opel Blitz trucks had an afterlife of its own. German steel was in high demand for reconstruction. The metal from thousands of demolished military vehicles was melted down and reformed into building materials, machinery, and new vehicles for peacetime use. In a very real sense, the substance of Hitler's war machine was literally reshaped into tools of peace and reconstruction. A truck that carried ammunition to the front in 1944 might have become part of a steel beam in a school building by 1948, or a component in a civilian automobile by 1950. But the human stories connected to these trucks add another dimension to their fate. Veterans who served as Wehrmacht drivers sometimes encountered their old vehicles in unexpected circumstances after the war. One documented case involved a former German army driver who, while working as a civilian truck driver in 1952, realized he was driving the exact same Opel Blitz he had operated during the war. He recognized specific damage marks and a unique repair weld he had made himself in 1943. The vehicle had been captured, repainted, demilitarized, and eventually sold to his civilian employer. He drove it for another 3 years before it was finally scrapped. For many German veterans, seeing these trucks in Allied service or in civilian use triggered complex emotions. These vehicles represented their youth, their service, and often the traumatic experiences of war. Some veterans refused to have anything to do with them after the war, while others sought them out specifically, finding comfort in working with familiar machinery, even if it now served different masters. The The Soviet attitude toward captured German vehicles evolved over time. Initially valued as war reparations and useful equipment, by the 1950s they were seen as outdated relics. The Soviet Union had developed its own automotive industry and no longer needed German trucks. Many were simply driven until they failed, then abandoned. Rural areas across the Western Soviet republics had small graveyards of rusting German vehicles throughout the 1950s and 1960s, slowly being reclaimed by nature. The Cold War complicated the legacy of these trucks in another way. In West Germany, the post-war Bundeswehr needed vehicles, but anything associated with the Wehrmacht was politically sensitive. West Germany's new army deliberately chose new equipment to distance itself from the Nazi past. Any surviving Opel Blitz trucks in West German hands were rapidly phased out of official use. East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, had fewer qualms about using captured Wehrmacht vehicles in its early years, though by the 1950s these too were replaced with Soviet-designed vehicles. The Opel plant in Brandenburg itself became a symbol of Cold War division. The facility was in the Soviet zone and was eventually absorbed into the East German industrial system. The plant that had produced tens of thousands of Wehrmacht trucks was retooled to produce vehicles for the Eastern Bloc. The connection to the wartime Blitz production was deliberately downplayed in official East German history. Modern archaeology continues to uncover evidence of these trucks' final moments. Battlefield archaeologists working in former Eastern Front combat zones occasionally find remains of destroyed vehicles. One particularly moving discovery in Belarus in 2011 involved an Opel Blitz that had been hit by Soviet anti-tank fire in 1944. The truck had burned completely. An investigation of the wreckage revealed the remains of 7 Wehrmacht soldiers who had died in the attack. They were buried with military honors, and the truck wreckage was preserved as a memorial at the site. The digital age has brought renewed interest in these vehicles. Online communities of military vehicle enthusiasts share photographs, documentation, and restoration advice. Researchers have compiled databases attempting to track individual vehicles through serial numbers, unit markings, and photographic evidence. This work has revealed surprising patterns. Trucks that served in North Africa ending up in Norway, trucks from the Eastern Front finishing their days on Israeli farms, individual vehicles with service histories spanning 3 continents and multiple conflicts. The question of how many Opel Blitz trucks survive today in any form, even as rusted hulks, is impossible to answer precisely. Estimates suggest perhaps 200 to 300 exist worldwide, in various conditions from fully restored museum pieces to rusted frames in fields awaiting discovery. Each one represents a fraction of a percent of the original production, making them witnesses to one of history's most catastrophic periods. The fate of these 15,000 trucks mirrors the fate of Germany itself in the years after 1945, divided, repurposed, scattered across the globe, their original purpose destroyed, their substance transformed into something new. Some were obliterated in the systematic destruction of German military power. Others served new masters, repainted and reformed. A few survived through luck, hidden away or simply forgotten. And the rarest few remained intact, preserved by chance or intention, to serve as tangible links to a past that reshaped the world. When you see one of these trucks today, in a museum or at a military vehicle show, you're looking at an extraordinary survivor. This particular vehicle navigated not just the chaos of war, but the equally dangerous chaos of peace, the systematic destruction programs, the repurposing efforts, the decades of hard use, the environmental decay, the simple passage of time. Each scratch in the paint, each repair weld, each modified component tells part of a story that spans continents and decades. The Opel Blitz trucks were never glamorous weapons. They didn't have the fearsome reputation of German tanks or the mythic status of fighter aircraft. They were simply workhorses, performing the unglamorous but essential task of keeping armies supplied and mobile. Their fate after the war reflected that utilitarian nature. They were used, repurposed, scrapped, and forgotten by all but a few specialists and enthusiasts. Yet their story reveals truths about war's aftermath that more famous weapons cannot tell. These trucks carried soldiers to battles they would not survive, transported ammunition that would kill thousands, and supported a regime that brought catastrophe to Europe and the world. After that regime collapsed, the same vehicles became tools of reconstruction, recovery, and renewal. The metal and machinery held no inherent ideology. It was simply put to whatever use the current owners required. In this transformation lies a kind of redemption, not of the Reich they served, but of the principle that even instruments of war can be remade into instruments of peace. Stand in a field in Brandenburg today, near where the opal plant once hummed with wartime production. The factory is gone, the workers are dead, the Reich is ashes, but somewhere in that field, buried under decades of soil and vegetation, there might be remnants of a truck that rolled off that assembly line 80 years ago. Its journey from that factory to its final resting place contains a history more complex and far-reaching than its designers could have imagined, a history of conquest and defeat, destruction and survival, the end of one world and the difficult birth of another.